Welcome to the legislative breakfast. We're here to speak about the horrible things that go on inside of solitary confinement. We're also here to speak about our meaning the Stop Solitary CT committee, our bill, it's the Protect Act, also with the Lowenstein Clinic. We've drafted a bill called the Protect Act, and its purposes is, number one, to end solitary confinement on a whole, and in Connecticut, where Stop Solitary CT, we're an organization whose mission is to end solitary confinement in Connecticut, but we're also partnered with organizations all across the country with the same motivation, which is to end solitary confinement, because it's dehumanizing, it's detrimental to people's well-being and mental health, even the staff workers inside. And that's another part of what we're pushing for, because we're not only just not advertising, advocating for people who work inside. I mean, for who live inside, people who are incarcerated, but also people who work inside. So that's what the Protect Act is. And so today we have, for the panelists, we have Miss Kevnisha Boyd, we have Raisha Bivens, we have James Tillman, Mr. Melvin Medina, Miss Hope Metcalf, and Mr. Ben Howell. And I am Leighton Johnson. I'm the moderator. I'm a committee member for Stop Solitary CT, also education outreach coordinator, activist, educator, mentor, father, son, hopefully, in the future, husband, but not at the moment. I am someone who has spent time inside. I spent about 10 years inside, and a little over that actually. And then about close to 5 of those years was in solitary confinement. So I know firsthand the detrimental effects. I have PTSD. I didn't go in with this. I came home with this. It's something that I'm dealing with for my connection with God and my family, and just keeping myself active and busy and giving back to the community and doing what I can to stay somewhat in a sane mind. But the detrimental effects of solitary confinement is lasting, and that's the whole purpose of us advocating so hard and pushing to change the system. So I don't know if that was 5 minutes. May have been a little under or over, I'm not sure. So I guess we're gonna start with the intros for the panelists. And like I said, the speakers will be, firstly, Ms. Kevnisha Boyd. So Ms. Boyd, you have the floor.
Thank you, Leighton, and good morning. So as Leighton said, my name is Kevnisha Boyd, and I'm a member of the Stop Solitary Confinement Committee. Outside of the committee, I'm a licensed mental health counselor, owner of a mental health practice, and former mental health counselor for the Department of Corrections. I'm looking forward to being here this morning and sharing this space with everybody to discuss the human rights of incarcerated people on Human Rights Day. So thank you, and I'll pass it to the next panelist.
Okay, I'll go next. Good morning, everybody. My name is Raisha Bivens. I am a board member of Stop Solitary CT. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm an advocate for my brother Joshua, who was incarcerated and has schizophrenia, and I do that work for other people who are navigating the justice system. Looking forward to being with everyone today.
Go next. Hey. Nah, no worries. Hey, folks, my name is Melvin Medina. Everybody calls me Mel. I'm the Public Policy and Advocacy Director at the ACLU Connecticut, also an organizer committed to working alongside impacted people on these very important issues. And just glad that I was able to be here with y'all. I'll pass it over to Ben.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Howell. I'm a physician here in New Haven, Connecticut, also a faculty member at the Yale School of Medicine and in the SEICHE Center for Health, SEICHE Center for Health and Justice. And as a researcher, I also research the health impact of incarceration, especially for people returning back to the community. And also, similar to Mel, I'm just glad I can be on this to share my wisdom and knowledge. I'll pass it to Hope.
Hi, good morning. My name's Hope Metcalf, and I teach at the Law School at Yale, and I teach a human rights clinic. And since 2010, I've been working with the ACLU of Connecticut and many students over the years, as well as people incarcerated at Northern, to investigate and to try to change the way Northern functions. And through this bill, it is our profound hope that it will close permanently. Over the last decade, I have come to believe that it is a place that is simply incompatible with our values. And it's a real privilege to be here, especially with the Stop Solitary folks who are bravely leading this. And with that, I'll turn it over to James. James, do you want to introduce yourself?
Mr. James, you may be muted.
They had me. Yeah, they had me.
Oh, there we go.
I was unmuted. Could everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm James. I'm a used car salesman right now. And just here, I'm glad to be here with everybody. This is a serious topic we're dealing with here. I'm a part of it, and I just hope that that we can get all the bills passed to help those that that's in the situation now that I used to be in, that's still affecting me today. Thank you everyone for even just hearing all you, and just being in there. If I was in there and I'd be like knowing that people like you out here, I'm like, okay, thank you for helping us. You know what I mean? So I'm just glad to be here, and whatever I can do to help, I'm here to help.
Yes. Thank you all for the introductions. And James, God bless you. Thank you for speaking and giving your your voice. And I think we're a little bit under time. So I was supposed to be a minute for each panelist, but it's all good. I just to piggyback off of what you said, to the fact that to know that people are out here fighting it is like invaluable, because that was, when I was inside, that's one of the main things that I was, thinking about, like, oh, do people care that what we're going through? Do people even know what we're going through? That's number one. And when I first reached out to the Lowenstein Clinic, I think in 2010, that was what was pressing in my mind, that no one cared and no one knew. That's why most people didn't care, because they didn't know. People who did know, it was like whatever. So yeah, blessings to you all, and thank you all for your intros. Next, we're going to speak about the bill itself, the PROTECT Act. And yeah, so we're going to go through that piece by piece, the different components of the bill. And so first, the first person to speak to the bill, and it's going to be about Northern CI, would be Mr. Mel Medina. So you have the floor, sir.
Thanks, Leighton. Hey, folks, thank you for joining this call. I think it's important that I start out talking about what Stop Solitary Connecticut represents and why it's so important. There's been a 26-year history to undo the harms of mass incarceration and the harms of solitary confinement in particular. And it started with the opening of Northern, though there were issues of solitary confinement before Northern. But the work of Stop Solitary carries on that tradition of fighting back against a system that has been designed and intended to harm people. And so I'm proud to be able to be on this panel with y'all. I'm proud of the work that you all are doing and leading. And also, you know, could never not acknowledge the fact that Barbara Fair, who I consider like the mother of the movement, of every movement, was fighting that in the 90s, was fighting that in the early 2000s, and is still fighting that today. And so much of what I do is inspired by Barbara. I'm just trying to do a little bit of what she's done throughout her life. So anyways, all that to say, I'm just really honored and so glad to be here. I think my role is to provide context for people who don't know the story of Northern, the real story of Northern. So let's just go over some basics. Northern Correctional Institution is a state supermax prison. It was built and opened in 1995. It cost the state at that time $44 million to build. In today's dollars, that'd be about $77 million. And it was the capstone to a 10-year, $1 billion prison expansion project that Connecticut undertook in the 1990s to deal with a decades-long prison overcrowding problem. In the early 80s, the state of Connecticut passed a number of statutory changes to its criminal code and the way people were handled in criminal court, to determinate sentencing, to issues related in truth in sentencing, and we had a skyrocketing prison population. In addition to that, we also had extremely old facilities. In the early 80s, we had facilities that they had first opened in the 1920s, for example. Everything about Northern's design, its programming, its practices were at the time and still today are brutal. And it's important that you understand that. It was designed to be a brutal experience. The dehumanization experienced in this facility is intentional. Upon its opening, the state launched a marketing campaign. You can go back into the Hartford Courant and go back into old articles, and you'll see there was a state-sanctioned marketing campaign glorifying and celebrating its newest facility designed to punish incarcerated people for rule violations, for nuisance, issues of nuisance, and acts of violence towards staff. A tagline, the marketing tagline for Northern was a place for the worst of the worst. And that was neither original nor accurate. In fact, Professor Kara Mint-Ryder, who's a law professor at UC Berkeley, has written a book called 23-7 Pelican Bay, Prison in the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement, writes about the history of the rise of supermax prisons. This is something that actually took the nation by storm. We had maybe one or two in the early 80s, and by the end of the 90s, almost every state had one. The supermax prison building spread across states and correction systems throughout the country in the late 80s and during the 90s, and all of them were marketed the same way: facilities built for the worst of the worst. State governments built these institutions, it's important for you to understand, with no evidence-based research, fortifying the claims of improving safety for either staff or incarcerated people. The development and expansion of these facilities were driven by correction staff, people who had zero understanding or expertise on the psychological effects of short-term or long-term solitary confinement. So not just Connecticut spent millions of dollars, but across the country, we spent billions of dollars on facilities designed to inflict harm through long-term solitary confinement with little research as to what its effects would ever have been. That tagline, the worst of the worst, was also incredibly inaccurate. No one is sentenced to Northern because of heinous crime. The people transferred to our state's supermax prison at the time of its opening were one of three groups. The first group was any incarcerated person that was already on death row. They had already been housed in a maximum security prison in Connecticut, but it was decided that they would be moved to this now new built facility, the supermax prison. And that decision was about politics of retribution and punishment that purely drove that decision. And that was really because of the tough on crime era. The second group of people was anyone that was charged with or believed to have assaulted a DOC staff member. But when the state built Northern, there had been no conclusive evidence that the introduction of a supermax prison reduced violence in any way system-wide. And the fact that fact is actually still true today. You'll hear DOC say that Northern makes their system safer, but there's been no conclusive evidence in any of the research that's gone into supermax prisons that actually fortifies that claim. The third group was anyone who was considered a nuisance. In other words, people who were disruptive and halted the flow of daily corrections business in any facility, a prison block, a cell, or dormitory. Correction staff enjoyed this broad discretion to rid facilities of quote unquote problems. And in the following years, the DOC added a fourth category for incarcerated people thought to have an affiliation with a prison gang. Regardless of the category, the underlying premise was the same. Northern's function was, for the lack of a better term, in their mind, a waste management system. Its purpose was to take quote unquote undesirable people and return them to the correction system disciplined and reformed through extreme solitary confinement. And here is the biggest lie that correction staff continue to perpetuate. There is no conclusive evidence that a supermax prison or long-term solitary confinement improve incarcerated people's behavior. In fact, there's evidence that it actually makes it worse. It harms people's mental health. This is especially true for people who have mental illness. There is no evidence in 1994 when Connecticut built Northern and spent $77 million, and there's no evidence today that it actually achieves the things that they claim it achieves. Northern is a brutal experience, and I want you to walk away understanding that. The sole focus of its design was extreme sensory deprivation. The isolation is so devastating that corrections administrators' biggest concern upon the opening of Northern, documented in articles in newspapers, was the impact that Northern would actually have on their own staff. Northern was also an attempt to legitimize and sanitize practices that dehumanize incarcerated people. Northern was designed as the full realization of the 18th century social theorist Jeremy Bentham's panopticon theory, an institution building designed to exercise full control and surveillance over people with limited and no contact with staff. A person locked away in a 12 by 7 cell was devoid of any social or environmental feedback. And when you were allowed to leave yourself for a very limited time, it's always in shackles. The state built Northern to break people. The state designed practices and programming that humiliated, dehumanized, and punished people. This isn't hyperbole. Before Northern was open to receive transfers, the state opened it to the public for a public tour, reflecting just how bizarre the public's thirst for retribution in the 1990s era was. Thousands of people across Connecticut actually showed up to tour the Northern facility. In a Hartford Courant article in 1995, one visitor remarked after touring the facility with a simple quote, "This is inhumane." And that in of itself, at its opening, by a random person who showed up in that facility, crystallizes truly what Northern is, entirely inhumane. Shortly after its opening, Northern received its first prison transfers. And here again is the biggest lie. Despite all the claims of Northern being built for the worst of the worst, its first transfer were for prisoners who had organized a work stoppage in protest against a new smoking ban that took effect in Enfield Correctional Institution. It wasn't violence. It was incarcerated people who organized against a policy that they didn't like. And the only power that they had was the flow of corrections business. Despite all the state's marketing and fear mongering, it took only days to reveal who Northern was actually designed to break. 2 months after Northern opened, a 23-year-old Latino man would hang himself in a 12 by 7 cell at Northern. In the years that followed, lawsuits were filed on behalf of incarcerated people who were abused at this facility, who were protesting inhumane conditions. 2 years after its original opening, the strategy of the waste management, quote unquote, system was thrown out because of continued prison overcrowding. And what ended up happening is that the state supermax prison, individual cells were now being double bunked. to accommodate the overcrowding problems, which in and of itself made Northern even more extremely dangerous. By the early 2000s, advocacy organizations filed lawsuits due to unconstitutional confinement for conditions for people with mental illness experienced at Northern. In fact, corrections officers within AFSCME themselves were quoted in Hartford Courant in the early 2000s with a growing concern that Northern was just being filled with people that were struggling with mental illness. Northern does not keep people safe. It harms people. It was designed to, and throughout its 26-year history, that harm has been disproportionately experienced by Black men, by Latino men, and by men who are struggling with mental illness. This is the short version of Northern's origin, but it's actually the real story. Northern did not actually solve the problems that DOC was trying to solve. Even the claim that Northern was aimed to help solve the issues of violence within DOC facilities failed to actually meet what was really happening in DOC. There was a growing prison overcrowding process, and those issues of overcrowding confinement were raising tensions. As the prisons were growing in population, DOC needed to respond by hiring new staff. So the proportion of new and untrained staff with a lack of experience in DOC facilities grew tenfold. And those facilities that they already had, admittedly by DOC in public statements, were poorly designed to begin with, that created a sense of danger. But more importantly, it's about the practices and what Northern represents. The practices developed in that facility and exported throughout our state's correction system, like the extended use of restraints, solitary confinement, are in serious need of external oversight and reform. And for all of these reasons, Connecticut needs the PROTECT Act. And I'll just end with this. If none of this is compelling reasons for the state to close Northern, know that in 2019, there was 268 people at Northern. The state was spending over $65,000 per person to house them in that facility. That population, that's twice as much the cost of incarcerating someone, for example, at Cheshire. The population at Northern today is hovering around 80 or so people, likely meaning that the current cost of incarcerating someone at Northern is hovering now around $200,000 per incarcerated person. It's a financial issue. It's a lack of investment in the real issues and the real problems that we need to solve. But really, it's a brutal and inhumane facility that needs to be closed. And any practices or programming that originated in that facility and has been exported out to the rest of the DOC facility needs to be deeply questioned. And if anything, it needs to be abolished. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you, sir. Very, 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 very well put. I think we were supposed to both go and speak about Northern, but I think you put it so poignant and touched on every aspect of it from its inception to now, and even how it has now trickled down to other parts of the system on a whole. So we speak a lot about Northern itself, and I know, like I said, spending close to 5 years inside of that place, how much it damages people. But on a whole, those practices are in different prisons throughout of Connecticut, and it's affecting a lot of people, and not just the people that's inside. It's affecting the families as well. So once again, thank you for that. You spoke about overcrowding, and from its inception, that was I guess the reasoning for them opening the place. And you also spoke about dehumanization. And I also would like to add that the segregation of people who stand up against injustice and violations of civil and human rights. Just to give a little quick story of Northern, from my time in Northern, the people who are equipped with the knowledge of the laws from outside, as well as the knowledge of the inner workings of the laws, the administrative directives, the things that you could use to the grievance procedure, how to redress, get some type of redress to some injustices. Those people are targeted and isolated and put in even in Northern, put in places that's chaotic so that you cannot educate other inmates on how to advocate for themselves, or they separate. Let's say I'm a person who knows the law from the outside as well as inside, and another person, and we educate each other on a tier, and we educate other people. What they would do is they would separate us because we're strong and we're leaders, and we teach people how to fight. And I don't mean fight physically. I mean fight with the law. That in itself, and that's just not just Northern, but that's throughout the system. But I like how you spoke from its inception to now. So my question to you is, from its inception to now, what do you believe is the justification for Connecticut's obsession with extreme isolation and punishment?
That for me, Leighton?
Yes, sir.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think I spoke a little bit of it. I think we often forget, Connecticut had, like the rest of the country, experienced an era of mass incarceration itself, really beginning around the civil rights era. When we talk about the proportion of Black men in particular in Connecticut's prison population, that 44% number, 40 to 44% number that we often are talking about, that was actually cemented in the mid 1960s, right around the same time that Connecticut's largest cities were dealing with growing inequity and also growing movements for the full realization of equality for our Black communities at that time, and then later on in the 1970s, the Latino communities, particularly the Puerto Rican population, that was also trying to fight for its own equal rights. And so, everything that Northern became it was leading up to and a doubling down on this idea of retribution and individualized punishment, and a rejection of reviewing and understanding systemic failure and the government's responsibility in systemic failure. I mean, Reagan in the 1980s is like the pinnacle of this, right? Where we put on blinders about what the role of the government has been in the disinvestment in cities, primarily cities of color. Also the history of redlining, the history of disinvestment, the history of over-policing. And what we ended up creating, I'd argue even almost intentionally, is a system in which we were incarcerating communities of color, and then turning back on those same communities and saying, we don't know what the problem is here. It seems like we can't really rehabilitate you. You know what you need? You need more punishment. You need more abuse. And so to me, Northern in 1995 is the full realization of that ideology. When it was being built, it was the same time that Governor Rowland was running for office. He was running as a tough on crime governor. In fact, people give us all slack because of how hard we are on Governor Lamont to lead and be a progressive and just like a compassionate human and understanding of the impact of incarcerated people. It's because we're only ever one governor away from reverting back to a tough on crime era. And so Northern, the $77 million, that it cost, was just the full realization of a public and political thirst to punish people. I don't think that building could be built today. You can't justify that in today's climate. But your advocacy of Stop Solitary is so important because your narrative, you're pushing for the value of all people and all incarcerated people, is what prevents other Northerns from being built and will lead to the eventual closure of that facility.
Thank you, sir, and thank you. And in the sense of time, I think we should just move right on into extreme isolation, and I think Ms. Raisha Bivens is first up, so you have the floor.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mel, for that, very powerful conversation about Northern. So today, I'm going to really be addressing part of the PROTECT Act, which is addressing the fact that what is solitary? And where we come from as Stop Solitary CT is that solitary confinement is not just restrictive housing, as the Department of Corrections will call it. It doesn't matter what it's called. Solitary confinement is a state of being. And in the state of Connecticut, there are at least 3,600 people that are in the general population in a prison, and they're in their cells for 21 hours or more out of a day. I got involved as a justice activist when my brother Joshua, who has schizophrenia, was incarcerated 3 years ago. Now imagine, I was a social worker for 12 years, and I was just shocked and appalled that for someone that had a serious mental health diagnosis prior to him entering the Department of Corrections, there was no alternatives to incarceration. And learning that he was confined in his cell 21 hours a day, there were many nights where I was afraid, was he going to survive? Was he going to make it? And this is the case. I'm going to be speaking a lot about my brother in the time that I have, but I want you to listen to my story through the lens of there are thousands of people in Connecticut who have a similar situation and are being impacted this way. So to say a little bit more about my brother and his situation, he entered the Department of Corrections. I started advocating immediately to see if he could go to another treatment setting because he was being held on bond pre-trial. And that's another point, that there are many people incarcerated in the state of Connecticut in these conditions that are not sentenced. They haven't been convicted of a crime. They're there pre-trial because they can't afford their bond, which was the case in my brother's situation. And, in the first year of his incarceration, despite me advocating, I wasn't able to get his bond lowered. And my brother started to express hopelessness. If I have to spend 5 years in here, I don't know if I'm going to make it. There were times where I didn't hear from him because the facility was on lockdown. And I just was wondering, is he going to make it? Or is this going to be enough for him? And now I want to address another part of solitary confinement. There is this notion that solitary confinement actually is used to punish people who have behavioral issues. So the notion is not necessarily accurate, and there's a lot of nuances to this point. So in my brother's situation, he has schizophrenia. One of the symptoms of schizophrenia is sometimes you hear auditory hallucinations. So there was a time where he got into a fight with his cellmate because he thought his cellmate was trying to do something with him. And he was put in solitary confinement for 7 days. Then there was another incident where my brother was thought to threaten a correction officer. And in all of these instances, he was hearing voices. Now, fortunately, by that third time, I had been in touch with the social worker and the entire clinical team, letting them know there was a change. And instead of, another incident happened, and instead of putting him in solitary, they put him in the infirmary in the prison, which is a whole nother topic that I'm not going to get onto. But imagine that my colleague Dr. Ben Howell is going to address this more, but imagine someone being punished for mental health symptoms that they cannot control. This is not a one-off situation that my brother experienced. This happens in the Department of Corrections because we're viewing people through this lens and this filter of people are criminals and they're inherently bad. And philosophically, our bill, the PROTECT Act, is that, yes, we can hold people accountable for what they do and treat them humanely and with dignity. Because one of the missions of the Department of Corrections, if you look at the mission, safety and rehabilitation, we are failing horribly in the state of Connecticut and corrections with the rehabilitation piece. Now, I'm just going to fast forward a little bit in my brother's story. This past year, and I believe it was in July, I got a call from my brother saying, Raisha, I want to let you know that I have diabetes and I'm now needing insulin. And already 3 years of my brother being inside, I could see him gaining weight and he became obese in prison. In that moment, I'm just like, I don't know if he's gonna survive these conditions. And through my advocacy, I was able to finally get his bond lowered and get him to a treatment setting. A judge listened because he was now insulin dependent on diabetes. His BMI was off the charts. And within 2 weeks of being in the new setting, he was off of insulin. His hemoglobin A1C went from 11, which is off the charts with diabetes, to 7, almost normal. This is the environment of extreme isolation that contributed and caused my brother to have diabetes. It did not heal him. It made him worse. So do I still have a couple seconds or should I stop?
You can go ahead.
Okay.
You got about a minute or so. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So the point is that we have people with serious mental illness are disproportionately in prisons and jails across the state of Connecticut. Solitary confinement causes mental illness. And the impact, what we need to understand is that the impact is not just for the incarcerated people when they're inside, it's on their families. It's on my mother. It's on my brother's father. It's on his uncle. It's on when Joshua is going to be released. Most people inside are going to be released and do not have life sentences in prisons. Research says that people who are in solitary are 3 times as likely to return to prisons as those who are not. This is a public health issue that will impact and is already impacting our community. And if we want to have people leave prison rehabilitated and healthy and well, we need to transform the system so that people truly get the care, the treatment, and the rehabilitation that they need. And that is the philosophy of our bill. Because anyone listening on this call, you could find your loved one in this situation. All it takes is a mistake. Or even more than, that's shortly put, but it's true. My brother before incarceration worked full-time, lived alone, was in college, did well with appropriate treatment and with appropriate supports. That's the future that many people in DOC can have. So thank you.
Thank you, Miss Bivens, for your story. And, we have a friendship, so I know how it affects you and your family. And I'm in prayer with you that things work out how they should. So blessings
Thank
to
you.
you and your brother. Mr. Howell, you have the floor. And like I said, in the sense of time, could you top it off at 3 minutes?
Yeah, I will be brief because honestly, all I will have to say is as a physician and as a researcher who studies these issues, all I can do is amplify what Ms. Bivens and Mr. Johnson and Mr. Medina have already said. And one thing I want to make sure that is loud and clear: solitary confinement, whatever you call it, whether it's restrictive housing, special housing units, segregation, that use of extreme isolation in correctional settings, whether for disciplinary or administrative reasons, causes irreparable harm on incarcerated individuals. I mean, the stories that we've heard about Rahisha's brother and Mr. Johnson, those are not unique stories. And unfortunately, when we look at any time when this has been studied, it broadly shows that solitary confinement really causes severe psychological harm. It has been associated with increased psychological distress, increased psychosis, as well as increased hostility, increased self-harm, as well as suicidal behaviors. And this can occur even with a short amount of time in solitary, but obviously we know that people are sometimes spend years in these conditions. I also just want to say that, as Ms. Bivens' story about her brother as well, is that the correctional system does not have the tools to handle people with serious mental illness. And unfortunately, they use the tools they have, which is solitary confinement and Northern. And unfortunately, that just causes increased harm for these individuals. I mean, and I think another point I'd like to make is that harm, and we already heard this from Mr. Johnson, is that these harms they don't stop when you leave the prison doors. The harms of solitary persist for years afterwards. Our research group here did sort of find that Mr. Johnson's story of experiencing PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder after being exposed to solitary is the case amongst many people who are exposed to solitary. Unfortunately, it also leads to increased risk of death, and that the risk of dying after being released from corrections, whether by suicide, violence, drug overdose, or other reasons, is 2 times, 3 times higher than other people who are incarcerated and do not experience solitary confinement. And so I think the role of Connecticut is to create humane solutions, to really sort of work with the input of medical professionals, roll back these punitive, inhumane sort of legacy of the past, and sort of really be leaders on this to create humane settings that honestly, that where our brothers, our sisters, our community members, our neighbors, so we do not put them in these torturous situations. And just in a quick note, I want to sort of add, especially in this moment of COVID-19 and the pandemic, I think we can see that Northern, it was there, it was more or less not empty, but it had a lot of space. And unfortunately, I think the Department of Corrections, not knowing what to do to create medical isolation, repurposed this brutal facility for the role of medical isolation, which as a physician just seems crazy to me, that we need to think about sort of giving the corrections the tools they need to deal with these types of situations. And that if we are going to put people in medical isolation, to give them the support that they need, whether that be input from medical and mental health professionals, whether that be connecting with their family or people on the outside, or other issues like that. But I will, in the sake of time, I will stop there and give it to the next panelist.
Thank you, Mr. Howell. Just real quick before we transition to the next topic, I just wanted to speak to what Miss Barbara Fair said in the chat about the language of how we use the language of people who are incarcerated. I think the culture is one of the main things that needs to change in order for these practices to change. And a lot of us, even people who were inside, use the language of inmate or prisoner or whatever, and that kind of like dehumanizes the people. So humanizing the people is what a lot of us, yourself included, Mr. Howell, just spoke of, and I speak of a lot. I've had conversations with even correctional officials who, address me as Johnson, and I'm not in prison anymore. So for you to address me as that just kind of re-traumatizes me and brings me back to a setting of being inside of prison. And so I think even the language of even addressing staff members, because we address officers as officers or COs or whatever, and even that language maybe need to change, that they're all staff members. And maybe if we could humanize both the staff and the prisoners, and excuse me, you see what I mean? I just call them prisoners. The people who are incarcerated, then maybe we could see everyone as people. Some people who have made mistakes, some people who were accused of things, may not even be guilty, but and people who work inside. And so thank you for what you spoke to, and let's transition to the next panelist, who Ms. Kevnisha Boyd, who speak about ending the abusive restraints. Thank you.
Thank you, Leighton. So actually, Hope is gonna go first.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, really wonderful to be with you all. And Kevnisha and I have the dubious task of describing even further torture that happens, particularly at Northern, but elsewhere in the system. So we've heard today about how it is that extreme isolation it both causes and exacerbates mental illness. And so I have, over the past 10 years, along with my students and other attorneys, interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of people who are have survived these practices like Mr. Johnson has. And they have described a further circle of hell, which is the use of in-cell restraints. And so at Northern, when people almost inevitably start to decompensate, which in that context might look like any number of behaviors, covering the small cell window to try to get attention because you haven't been delivered toilet paper, or because you saw a CO spit in your food, or because you are starting to feel like you want to harm yourself, or maybe you are harming yourself, or you've become psychotic and you've started to rub feces all over your body. These are all stories I've heard multiple times. Then the go-to response is actual violence. And the reason why it's, I'm pleased that Stop Solitary is taking this up is because the name solitary is really a misnomer. There is really nothing solitary about the experience of being in a supermax prison or in an isolation unit. It is an antisocial experience for sure, but you are surrounded by constant social toxic interactions like the ones I've just described. So when you start to deteriorate, there is a practice that is written into DOC policy that you may be forcibly extracted by a SWAT team who wear shields and masks, and you may be exposed to chemicals such as pepper spray, and then forcibly removed to another cell where you will then be chained, shackled at your wrists and ankles, and then and those shackles will then be tethered with a tether chain to connect your wrists and ankles so that you immediately lose range of motion. And in the directives, it says that you're supposed to get a medical check to be sure that the shackles aren't too tight, and they're supposed to make sure that the tether chain is sufficiently long so that you can stand up straight. That came as a result of litigation and other but I can tell you that that is not routinely observed. I have seen scars on people's wrists and on their ankles. I have interviewed many, many people who have spent days, not hours, days in shackles in a locked cell, unable to stand, unable to wipe themselves after using the toilet, unable to eat. We've talked to people who have had to pour their food onto the floor and eat it like a dog. This is happening now. The DOC has refused to change these practices. They say that the people inside are too dangerous and that they can't be trusted. But the truth is that they are being driven to behave in ways that the DOC is creating the violence that it then seeks to oppress, and it's not a lasting solution. My clinic filed a complaint with the UN Special Rapporteur on torture last year, and describing both the long-term isolation, the disproportionate use of it on people with serious mental illness, as well as the use of restraints. And he said these allegations do amount to torture. So I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm trained as a human rights practitioner. I do not use the word torture lightly, but that is in fact what's happening now. And the tactics that I spent another 10 years working on behalf of people who were tortured by the US government previously at Guantanamo during the 2000s. And the tactics, the tactics that we see used routinely at Northern are very similar. And they are torture tactics that are used around the world. And it's my prayer that that we can move beyond this in the state. There's no need that we need to be doing this to our own people, and it's time to stop. So I'll turn it over to you, Kevnisha.
Thank you, Hope. Thank you. So very quickly, I'm gonna share my experiences as a former mental health counselor for the Department of Corrections. So as Hope described and as Raisha described, Department of Corrections houses majority of people who have a history of mental health conditions or currently have a mental health condition. The Connecticut State's Commission completed a study last year that indicated 68% of people incarcerated in Connecticut have a history or current mental health condition. So this is a human rights issue for people who are struggling. So as Hope mentioned, the people who are struggling, who could benefit from a mental health intervention, begin to show behaviors that would indicate that they need more help. Instead, the Department of Correction chooses to enforce excessive punishment using abusive restraints. So as a former employee, I'd like to share an experience that highlights exactly how that happens in Department of Corrections. March of last year, Carl Talbot was admitted to New Haven Correctional Center for violation of parole. He was admitted into the medical infirmary for not being fit for general population. He was later pepper sprayed 3 times by a supervisor, put in a wheelchair, on the elevator, to restrictive housing, to be isolated in confinement and chained to himself without the ability to move, as Hope described. 2 hours later, Carl Talbot was unresponsive and was later found dead. Connecticut doesn't have any legislation or laws. Department of Corrections doesn't have any practices that prevent this from happening. So here, Department of Corrections reports that their mission is to rehabilitate people, but I assure you, as working there for 4 years, don't believe it. There's not enough rehabilitation being done in the Department of Corrections to address the issues of 68% of people having a mental health condition. Department of Corrections can't afford to continue to operate as a punitive system. It has to shift to operate towards a rehabilitative system, because most people that are housed there have a medical or mental health condition that are not being addressed. And as Raisha and Leighton described, oftentimes people who are incarcerated are discharged with symptoms and conditions that are way worse than when they went in. So for the sake of time, I'm also going to combine my reasons for having to resign from Department of Corrections. So it was my dream job. I had invested a lot of time, a lot of money into securing the job, again, to be a mental health counselor for Department of Corrections. I went in with a superwoman cape. I thought I was gonna be able to offer treatment. I thought I was gonna be able to address people who are incarcerated mental health issues. I thought I was gonna be able to address trauma issues. And the truth is, quite the opposite happened. What started to happen was, after I started to witness incarcerated people be beat bloody, isolated, verbally abused, physically abused, neglected, abandoned, it started to really create this ethical and moral conflict. So as a licensed counselor, I have an ethical code. And the first part of that is to do no harm. So after 4 years, it really started to feel like I was participating, right, in this system that was intentionally harming people who needed the most help. After a while, that became overwhelming. I became irritable. I found myself even conforming to some of the toxic work practices. And that's not what I was there for. I was there to help. But when you care and you have a heart and you have morals in the Department of Corrections, unfortunately, you're isolated. So the day Carl Talbot died, I remember going into work that evening, and it was like a regular day. Nobody held a meeting. There was no meeting. There was no debriefing. There was no policy change. There was no, okay, this tragic incident happened. Here's what we're going to do to try to change it. Here's what we're going to do to try to make sure nobody else dies. None of that. It seemed to just be a regular day, normalized by everybody. So I grieved alone. I grieved alone that a man who has well-documented mental health conditions, medical conditions, and is also well known to the staff at New Haven. He was not a brand new person to us. We knew who he was. and yet and still, having exhibited mental health symptoms caused him to be restrained, chained, sprayed 3 times, and he died. Having that visual repeat over and over and over in my head, not having people to talk about it with, forced me to resign. It forced me to resign. And although it was my dream job, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be here because those traumatic experiences brought me here today to support the PROTECT Act. And I support the PROTECT Act from a professional perspective, from a personal perspective, as being a Black woman, and my community is most affected by the issues of solitary confinement and abusive restraints. So wholeheartedly, from professional and personal perspective, solitary confinement and Department of Corrections has to be reformed. There needs to be change, and there has to be consideration for vulnerable people, for all people, for Black people, because everybody has rights. So it's Human Rights Day, and it's important for us to make note, right, that incarcerated people's rights are being violated, they're being stripped, and when you're incarcerated, you don't have the resources to advocate for yourself. So I appreciate all the panelists here today, and I'm happy to be here to share my experiences, to share with everybody, to emphasize the importance of looking at Department of Corrections and really ending these abusive, racist, oppressive practices. So thank you. So
I'm sorry
Leighton.
about that. Thank
It's
you. I'm
okay.
sorry about that. I was responding to something, but
It's okay.
thank you for your very in-depth story, and it's really it's a personal story that affected you even as a mental health worker.
Right.
You spoke to not having no one to talk to about what you was going through, even as a mental health worker. So imagine what the people go through who are inside and have absolutely no one to talk to. Maybe you may have been a different kind of mental health worker, because my experience with a lot of mental health workers who they do cursory glances in cells, and they just it's protocol that they have to just go down the tier and check, and maybe not even check certain cells or whatever, but to actually have a time to sit there and talk to people on a whole, that I don't know that needs to change. But thank you for your story, and I hope that you can that's going to be always implanted in your brain, but I hope that you can heal from that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to, before we transition, I wanted to speak real quick to something that Ms. Hope Metcalf said about the practices in Northern, and I also want to emphasize the fact that we do speak a lot about Northern, but my question to you, Ms. Hope, is this practice, is this practice, are these practices taking place anywhere else besides Northern?
Yes, they are. I've had conversations, and we've seen documentation about similar incidents at Corrigan and at Walker, as well as at Garner.
Right.
And that's just a handful. My guess is that they are happening other places. We know that they even happened at a jail at New Haven CC. So, and there is nothing in the policies that says that they're limited to Northern at all. Same as to all of the use of force policies with DOC. It's one of the reasons why, as we'll be discussing in a bit, oversight is so critical.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And then also, I just wanted to also speak to something that Miss Raisha Bivens spoke about with her brother, getting diabetes when he was inside, and we speak a lot about the mental health side, myself included. Getting PTSD, something that I never dealt with mental illnesses or anything of that nature before I went inside, but also the physical medical harms. Like, for instance, when I was in Northern, and all of a sudden I got high blood pressure, which runs rampant through the system. And Northern, I think diabetes and high blood pressure being the highest. I don't know the numbers and I can't speak and I don't know statistics, but just from my experience, myself, and then just from knowing people, like everybody and their mother has high blood pressure and diabetes. And then once I got out of that place, and once I even stopped taking the medication because they give out medication like candy, but I stopped taking it and I started to actually work on myself and work out, because when you're in there, all you want to do is just eat and just not work out because you're depressed, and it's just toxic on your physical, your mental, and your medical. And and that's prison in it on a whole, but though these practices does that. So let's move on to Mr. James Tillman, who's going to speak about protecting social bonds.
Hello, everyone. My name is James Tillman. I am also a member of the Stop Solidarity Connecticut Steering Committee. I'm going to speak to you today, or this morning, about the imperatives to protect social bonds for all persons who are incarcerated. The PROTECT Act addresses this imperatives by calling for a guaranteed minimum of free letters, phone calls, and visits. Anything less constitutes undue psychological and spiritual and emotional deprivation, disrespecting the dignity and denying the very humanity of persons held in confinement. I know I have experienced the lasting harm of such deprivation. There isn't a day that goes by when I am not haunted by the experience. As some of you may know, I was wrongfully, I have a wrongful conviction. I spent over 18 years of my life in Connecticut prison system. With the help of the Innocent Project, I became the first person to be exonerated in Connecticut and was finally released in 2006. In total, I spent approximately 4 years in solitary confinement of them 18 years. I know every bone of my body and the damaging effect and the soul-stirring impact of such isolation confinement. To be confined in a box, inside a box, is a punishment made all more damaging when social contact are withheld or denied altogether. When I say a box, inside of a box, it's like being in a jail, inside of a jail. I sometimes used to refer to as a fishbowl. I just to speak on a few things about what Hope said about having feces all over you. I experienced a friend of mine that was in a cell next to me. His cell partner had put feces all over his body, and he was a young man, only like 20, 22. And he hollered out to me and said, "James, what should I do? My cell partner got feces all over him. He's naked with feces all over him. What should I do?" And I just shook my head and I said, "Look, call for the correctional officer and ask him to take you out that cell." And at which time he called for the correction officer, which there was nothing done. So I told him, wait for lunch and put your hand in the trap. That way they can extract him. They're going to mace everybody and get you out the hard. They're going to do it the hard way. From that day on, I knew I was in a dungeon. The first day I walked through, felt like I was underground. I went to Northern for fighting with an inmate, and I did 2 years and got out, and there was 3 inmates jumping on another inmate, which I knew they was about to kill him. and I jumped in that, trying to help that inmate, and they sent me back to Northern for another 2 years for trying to stop another inmate from getting stabbed up, killed. And my punishment was back at Northern. And then after Northern, they created a situation with me through mental health, whereas I went to Gardner, the mental health jail. I was on loss of commissary for a whole year. I was on loss of phones for a whole year. I had loss of visits for a whole year. The impact that had on my mother was just, I mean, it took it to another level. She already was dealing with the fact that her son was doing 45 years. She was already dealing with the fact that she know that I was in there for something I didn't do. Just the impact. And still today, I'm still going through a lot of stuff, just listening to, even sitting here listening to everyone speak, and the experiences really just like ripping me apart right now. And because I feel it and I experienced it. But one thing, when I was in prison, I wish that there was somebody outside speaking for me and working to change the system. But now that I'm out, I'm committed to advocating on behalf of those inside. I know what they are being subject to. I know the harms. I know the cruelty. I know the injustice of solitary confinement. I know the damages created by social isolation. I know we need a justice system that will protect those that are incarcerated, not destroy them. We need a system that will respect the human rights of those within it, not abuse them. We need a system that maintains social bonds, not sever them. The PROTECT Act will do that. Connecticut must do better. We need this legislation yesterday. Thank you. And I hope that we get it. God bless.
Thank you, Mr. Tillman. Every time you speak, brings me to a point of reflecting on my experiences, but also seeing the other side of the experience. I like to say that I think it's designed to break you, but like only the strong spirits, people who are strong and connected to a higher being and connected to have a sense of self, and I think those are the people who make it through. Like, you're not gonna make it through unscathed. So let's not even say that, but you be able to make it through, because you have no choice but to rely on your strength when you're in those type of settings. That's all you have is your strength and your connections to whoever you choose to call on. So thank you, and you are doing what you're supposed to do. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Bless you, brother.
Bless you, brother. With that being said, I had a question. Oh, it's people in the comments and the questions. I want to touch on that. Someone said, let me pull it up real quick. Someone said that okay, so I'm just picking randomly, but an anonymous attendee asked, are these practices also happening at youth correctional facilities? And I did answer in the chat, but they are. MYI, Manson Youth Institution, is for the youth, and it is happening there despite legislation that was supposed to end that practice. So it's still happening. And then also someone spoke about do not forget about the women at York, and I never do, and that's forgive me for not speaking to that specifically. I think that's another thing that people advocate across the country need to speak directly to, you know, the fact that it affects women and children as well. We need to amplify that, speak to that, because it is. And these are people's mothers, daughters, girlfriends, wives, sisters, aunts that are experiencing this, even to the extreme case of having, you know, their babies inside of solitary confinement. And this case is documented where people's babies have died inside solitary confinement. And then I just want to read something that Miss Barbara Fair wrote about her son, that it broke her son's spirit and shattered his mind, and that as a young teen, so that let's be clear about that, and that she will not stop fighting. In a sense of time, I can't touch on anything else right now. I will touch on it in the comments and in the Q&A session. So let's move on to Miss Kevnisha Boyd. I think you spoke a little bit to it, but just give a little bit more about staff wellness. I'm going to say staff wellness.
Sure. So a little bit more on correctional wellness is that the honest truth is that correctional officers are exposed to the highest exposure of trauma than any other profession in law enforcement. So I want to share some data with everybody. The Connecticut States Commission, excuse me, not the Connecticut States Commission, the Correctional Supervisors Council conducted a study of correctional officers and supervisors. And some of the information that the study concluded was that the most alarming for me was that correctional officers die in Connecticut 15 years younger than any other resident. Also, correctional officer supervisors, when they work a double, on average, get about 2.5 hours of sleep. So I don't know about anybody else, but if I got 2.5 hours of sleep and I went to work in a toxic, hostile environment, I'd be irritable. My judgment would be impaired, which would likely lead to the excessive force, the excessive abuse, lack of compassion, lack of empathy. And again, to go back to the point that 68% of people incarcerated have a mental health condition. So where's the compassion? Where's the empathy? Where's the treatment? The goal of Department of Corrections is to rehabilitate, but it's like, how are people incarcerated supposed to rehabilitate when the correctional officers are modeling a very toxic and abusive type of behavior? At the basic foundation of behavior modification, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. And for me, luckily, I'm a therapist. So when I worked there, seeking mental health treatment was natural. But honestly, the discussion of mental health inside the Department of Corrections in terms of staff being affected, nobody thinks it's real. Nobody wants to acknowledge it. It's usually a joke. So the staff don't even have the skills or the education or the tools to even be able to identify that I'm being vicariously traumatized from witnessing all this abuse, witnessing people kill themselves, witnessing people being so deprived that they will bang their head on a wall just to receive some kind of sensation, right? Because you lose your mind. You lose your mind. So the only thing you can hold on to is physical pain to remind yourself that, oh, I am alive. I am alive, right? Let me make myself bleed. Let me self-mutilate because I'm so deprived. So seeing that over and over again, and as a mental health counselor, my only two options were to send somebody to general population, maybe they'll survive, or I send them to the infirmary to suffer. So working at New Haven, there's one mental health staff on the weekend for the whole facility. So as an intake facility, people will come in on a Friday. If you're admitted into the infirmary, you don't get to see somebody or be evaluated or get medication until Monday. So you sit in a cell in the infirmary, having been deemed not appropriate for mental health, having been deemed severely mentally ill, and you sit by yourself, naked, with a Velcro gown for everybody to see with no help. So for me, that was really a big part of me leaving was, again, like, as a mental health counselor, I can't continue to do this. Ethically, I'm violating my ethical obligation. I can't continue to put people who are mentally ill into a room with no treatment. So that started to take a toll. And again, correctional officers, the environment is really toxic. There's a culture of overworking. There's a culture of, there's some system where you can look up everybody's salary. And that's what they do. They look up everybody's salary, who can work the most overtime, which basically, again, insinuates just you work. Where's the mental health? Where's the mental health? So no, correctional officers' wellness are not well. They're not well at all. They're actually suffering. And that's based off of, again, my experience working there for 4 years. And that's based off of the clear data that has been conducted to say that correctional officers are dying, they're overweight, they're not sleeping, and they're exposed to a very high amount of trauma. So incarcerated people are suffering. People who work there are suffering. So what is it doing? What is solitary confinement? What is the Department of Corrections actually doing? It's not rehabilitating. It's not a safe environment for anybody, essentially. So thank you.
I'm sorry about that. You always catch me when I'm typing
Okay.
something and then you end off. I'm sorry about the awkward silence, but yes. So the staff wellness is another component of our bill, and it's something that's major and something that even myself as someone who was inside, and at one point it was a us and a them type of mentality for me, and that was only from being on the receiving end of abuse and feeling like I didn't matter and I was being mistreated, and that's what stemmed to my mental thinking of it's us and them. But I think with growth and understanding that people, regardless of what side of the cell that they're on, are people, and people are affected, and if people can be treated humanely and like people, then maybe they can treat other people like humane and like people, and then that'll just be a revolving door of healing and respect. And we can't force people to be humane or to treat people with respect. You can't change the essence of certain people. Some people are just how they are, but I think just having these conversations and speaking to it, and then also legislation and laws being implemented would change a lot of things. So thank you, Miss Boyd. And we're gonna move right on into accountability from Ms. Hope Metcalf. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to make this brief because I think that the piece that I'm going to talk about is transparency and oversight. And the question that really Mel started with, which is how did we get here? How is it that this state that has an obligation to uphold the right of all people who live here, and we call ourselves the Constitution state, how is it that we have created a system that is wreaking such harm both on the people who we send to prison as well as the people who are working there? And under that circumstance, you might ask, well, who has known about what's going on? And the truth is that very few people. So Connecticut is really the only state in the country that has zero, truly no oversight, no transparency mechanisms. And the DOC is unique as a state agency for lacking that. So how did, Barbara Fair, you've heard about Barbara Fair. She came to this issue decades ago. She has been championing it. There's lots of people in the state who have been championing it from the outside. I came to know about this because people wrote to the ACLU and I went and talked to people. But that's not what it should take. We deserve better. And as Mel said, this is a really expensive system. It's expensive financially, it's expensive in terms of the cost of human lives. And so what the PROTECT Act says is like, well, maybe we should know what we're getting for our money here. And we should know how the state is treating its own residents. So what the PROTECT Act would do is it would reinstate an ombudsperson to have the authority to conduct independent investigations. It would create an independent complaint mechanism so that people on the inside have somewhere to go that's not through official DOC channels, because unfortunately that grievance process that the DOC runs is extremely ineffective. It has a dismissal rate of about 99% of grievances are dismissed. And it would also provide a community corrections council so that people which would require that at least a third of council members would have themselves experienced incarceration or have a loved one who's directly impacted. So that's what the PROTECT Act does in a nutshell. And in a time when the movement for Black Lives and other movements are asking us all in this country to think about both the particular practices, but also the structures that perpetuate injustice and inequality. I just want to say, I think that this piece is really critical to overhauling the system in the long term, and that we really, as taxpayers, as voters, as residents of the state, should demand and expect more, just as much transparency and oversight from the Department of Corrections as we do for the Department of Transportation. And right now we don't have that, and we deserve it.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Metcalf, for that. And we have a long history of, being in connection with each other I think over 10 years now. When I first wrote to you, to your clinic and to the ACLU, and I was in the worst period of my life at that time. So to come from there to now, and we're still fighting for this is kind of like, I'm not surprised, but it's crazy that we're still fighting for this. But at least, that we've made some progress, but it's way more that needs to happen. That's why we're pushing so hard to get this legislation passed. And I just thank you for all your support and everything that you have done.
Thank you, Clayton. I just would say I would not be doing this if it weren't for you and for Barbara and for the others on this team. I would have burned out a long time ago. So I'm very grateful. And also just to say that that this is a mighty crew. So there's a ways to go, but we've got great folks.
Right. Iron sharpens iron, so we make each other strong. So we're gonna move on. We're a little bit over time, but it doesn't matter. I think, and we're educating each other. A lot of people don't know about these practices, and that's why in the Q&A, it's a lot of questions about, because people are curious. Some people are surprised, like they don't know that this is going on, and they're very, very curious. And I wish I could do everything and still answer these questions, but we will get to those questions. But let's move on to the cost of solitary confinement. And we're gonna each spend, it's supposed to be 5 minutes. So let's start. Who's supposed to start? I'm everywhere now. The cost. Who's doing the cost?
So I think we've actually hit on most of the points about costs. So in terms of the financial costs, as well as the public health costs, the cost to communities and families, as well as the costs on staff. similar bills, such as the HALT Act in New York, there have been fiscal analyses done that estimate that banning long-term isolation would save the state approximately $132 million a year. That figure, which is very high, includes the savings that are kind of a holistic view on savings in terms of preventing additional violence, the public health costs when people leave and they need follow-up treatment, et cetera, as well as the costs on staff, for example, the overtime, workers' comp, disability, and those sorts of things. So the committee's in the process of doing a similar fiscal analysis for the PROTECT Act, but that's just to highlight that we expect significant savings. Closing Northern alone would have significant savings, which I'm sure Mel could speak to if we would like to go there.
Yeah, I mean, we know to date Northern runs somewhere around the vicinity of $19.6 million annually to run. We need to do a little bit more investigation in terms of personnel costs versus operational costs versus programming costs and all that. But clearly closing that facility, which is something that must be done morally, fiscally, all of the reasons must be done. Those savings, the reason I led with the history of Northern is because far too often when we talk about conversations around reinvestment, we're not understanding that it's to right a past wrong. This isn't just moving forward and saying, well, let's just reinvest better in the future. It's about understanding that we've caused harm to what Hope and all of these panelists have spoken to. We've actually harmed communities. Specifically, the history of incarceration in Connecticut, 50% of the people that were driven into those facilities came from New Haven, Bridgeport, New Britain, Hartford, and Waterbury. Those are the same communities that are also our largest reentry zones. And so these are systems that are designed really to harm people. They are very expensive. The PROTECT Act's push for oversight will be critically important to understand, as Hope said, how are we using taxpayer dollars? What it will reveal that we're using them inefficiently and fairly poorly. And it's this group that can articulate the ways that we need to reinvest in the future and how we actually invest and heal people versus harming and incarcerating people.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Okay, so I think we're going to move right into touching on these questions that people have and these comments. I read Ms. Barbara Fear's comment about, well, surviving the experience is one thing, she said, and healing is quite another. The true task following torture is the healing that restores one to wholeness. Again, without healing, people turn to drugs, alcohol, harming others, or self-harm. Northern drives people to madness. Solitary, some take their own life, many survive, and few heal, absolutely. And then she said that it was very informative. Miss Judy Michael, she said, thank you for your advocacy. Thank you, especially for the deeply personal stories, which are shared at a course of recalling trauma. And then holding you all in the light, holding incarcerated people suffering right now in the light. Stop Solitary CT has a powerful legislative campaign for 2021. And okay, so State Rep David Michael, I think his question was answered. An anonymous attendee said the best webinar on an important social issue they have heard. Thank you so much. And thank you for your comment. Alana Rosenberg, I am part of congregations organized for Connecticut. I'm interested in partnering with Stop Solitary to support the PROTECT Act. That's perfect. That's what we like to hear. And thank you all for being so brave and sharing your stories and maintaining hope that we can do this. For all who are interested in joining the movement and supporting in any ways, you can follow us at stopsolitaryct.org. You can check out any petitions that we may have. If you want to volunteer, if you want any calls to actions, you want to see any actions that we have coming up, or view some of our videos or anything, stopsolitaryct.org, and also we're on Instagram and Facebook. And just, thank you. Mr. Rosenberg, or Miss Rosenberg, Congregations Organized for New Connecticut. Miss Ann Hughes, she said, nailed it, Barbara. Systems designed to harm, segregate, and embed systemic racism in its very walls and bars of the cells. Absolutely. Shomari Beeman, she said that her little cousin died from being in solitary, and she encouraged his mother to fight, but they seem to think throwing money at us is justice, and it's not. And Kirk Wesley is here with Connect and Alana. Okay. Did I miss anything? Okay, so an anonymous attendee said, do COs undergo mental evaluation often? If they are found to be mentally incapable of handling prisoners, do they keep on working in prison? And Ms. Boyd answered that, no, there's never mental health evaluation completed on staff. And that's not good. Can we outline the strategy for lobbying on behalf of the PROTECT Act in the legislative session? And Mr. Galen answered, yes, we will be working with legislators to introduce the PROTECT Act at the beginning of the session. In terms of how CT residents can help, we'll be starting a digital organizing group that will launch in January. And this group will be an access point to figure out how to effectively plug your community into the campaign. Because I think that's the main thing that we need to do is plug in these different communities, the communities that, some people just absolutely don't care, and they think everyone that goes to prison is first of all guilty, and anything that they go through, they deserve. And then we don't even think about the people who are, wrongfully accused, people who are pretrial, people who the punishment doesn't match the what they're accused of, or the crime or the infraction, or it doesn't match up. It's extreme. It's extreme cases of abuse and isolation and things of that nature. And it's like overkill. Mr. Gary Winfield, if you want to do a discussion on lobbying, he said he's here. He is game to help anyone virtually who needs it. Okay, so that's a question that I think someone had about lobbying. Mr. Ed Davies, who are our current legislative advocates for our bill? Who can speak to that? I know we have Mr. Gary Winfield, Ms. Robin Porter. Can someone else come in and touch on that? Who's our current legislative advocates? Anyone? Okay.
Well, I think you've named the two top ones, and Senator Winfield's done incredible work on this and so many issues, and we're so grateful. And I think that the committee is already making strides in talking to leadership. And I'll just note that this is not a Democrat-Republican issue. I've talked to Republicans who get it, and at least many parts of the bill. And so there's, I think, a place at the table for I mean, I hesitate to say it, but I think that there's room here for bipartisan work. And the last thing I'll say, just on the lobbying strategy, which it's so exciting to see what Stop Solitary is doing with the digital platform. Something in past years we found is that centrist Democrats from white suburban districts need to be pushed on this, and it doesn't take that much in terms of constituents. So it's really exciting to see the networks popping up here from faith communities around the state and others, so that I think some pressure from suburban areas would go a long way, because the folks from urban areas who are pushing this have been carrying a lot of the water, and it would be really great for them to have support.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we have touched on the majority of, not all of the questions, but this webinar was recorded, and so you can find that on our website. This will be published, and then you can, any questions going forward, you can connect with us and then, can be on our email thread, and then those questions or any concerns or any ways that you want to be, join the movement, that can be done that way. I just want to say to all the panelists that you all did excellent, which I wasn't, concerned about. This is what y'all do. But I'm always, like Miss Barbara Fair, we spoke about that yesterday, that I'm always on the surface, it may seem like I have it all, figured out, I'm cool, but I'm on inside, I'm bugging out and I'm nervous and I'm like, is this gonna go right? But I think we did a great job. And yeah, so thank you all, and thank you for the panelists. Thank you all who the legislators who was on, all the attendees, everyone. And let's get this bill passed, man. Let's in a sense of justice and in a sense of humanity for people. Let's get this bill passed, man. Let's do this. Like, we care about people, man. So God bless you all, and you all have a great rest of your day and the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Have a good one.
All right, you as well.